to Breakfast with Simply Scran. Simply Scran is a campaign to ensure that everyone gets 3 nutritious meals a day in Scotland. Today's conversation is all about what breakfast means to individuals and communities and what needs to happen to ensure no child or young person in Scotland starts their day too hungry to learn. I'm Snow, the policy officer at Includum, and I'm joined by someone who's been working hard on this issue, Finlay Elmond from Magic Breakfast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we jump into it, Finlay, can you give me a quick introduction to who you are and what Magic Breakfast does?
So my name's Finlay. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Officer at Magic Breakfast, so I cover all our public sector and other charity engagement here in Scotland. As a charity at Magic Breakfast, we've been going for about 20 years now. We work in schools across Scotland and down in England as well, just over 1,000 schools, delivering breakfast for around 200,000 children and young people every morning, making sure that they start their day ready to learn. And we work with schools to develop programs that can be embedded in the school environment to make sure that there's a sense of community in the work we do, to make sure that we bring food in an accessible, hunger-focused and barrier and stigma-free way.
I know people often say that the most important meal of the day is breakfast. Why is that? And why are some people struggling to access breakfast regularly?
What we see and what our schools experience is that what breakfast does is it sets children and young people up for the day ahead. So it makes sure that when that school bell goes, when learning's ready to start, that they're ready to sit down and engage for that entire day, rather than just waiting and maybe later in the day to have food. What it means is that from the bell, they can go straight through and engage in a way that otherwise some children and young people can't. And it supports a wider classroom environment if everyone there starts their day at that same base level, that equitable level, to make sure that they can all have that achievement and attainment going forward.
I saw reports earlier this year that 250,000 children and young people could be going to school hungry, so they're not getting that opportunity that you're talking about. How does that impact children and young people in their education?
Yeah, so we did quite a significant piece of mapping research earlier this year, and it resulted in a report called Hidden Hunger that we launched around April time. And what that found, that looking here in Scotland, if you take all the schools that deliver breakfast provision in all its forms, and then you take all the schools that either have no breakfast provision or have provision that can create significant barriers to accessing it, so either significant cost barriers, a very limited number of free places able to access that, what you're left with from the data is the risk, as you said, of 250,000 children, 250,000 young Scots not being able to access breakfast provision and being at risk of being too hungry to learn at the start of that school day. And that can have massive impacts from what our schools tell us. It can have impacts on mental and physical well-being. It can have impacts on attainment, on attendance, on classroom cohesion. So not just on those children and young people who don't access breakfast, but the effects it can have on them can therefore affect the classroom environment, so that can affect children who have been able to have breakfast provision. So it has quite a drastic and significant impact. And if you speak to teachers, as we do, we engage regularly with all the schools that we work in, you can hear from them quite how visible the signs of hunger are for children and young people. So what we want to do is make sure that we can take that barrier to learning away. That what poverty can create is quite a significant number of barriers. As we're hearing throughout Simply Scran this week, at various different stages of the day, and then other aspects of life, that poverty can be quite pernicious within. What we do is just take one barrier away, and it's quite a significant barrier, but you need these number of steps to be able to support ending what can be quite a cyclical process of poverty.
At Includum, we often talk about you've got the attainment gap that's often poverty related, and you can see significant impacts of that from really, really young ages. But that's a part of this much wider well-being gap for children and young people. How does breakfast support almost that wider level of well-being beyond just attainment or in the school environment?
Yeah, so whilst attainment is massive, especially in closing that attainment gap, as there is that national focus on here in Scotland, it builds up a school day that can just be so different from how else it could be. One of the things our schools tell us is that breakfast provision in the morning can create a safe environment to be able to support children and young people in so many different ways. It can open up conversations. It can allow engagement with children and young people to support them more than just their learning, beyond that educational attainment. Upwards of 90% of the schools we work in here in Scotland show and demonstrate that link between the work they do on delivering breakfast and then into supporting physical well-being, emotional well-being, attendance. And the biggest one is not necessarily attainment, but readiness to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So children and young people want to get involved. They want to get engaged. And what we do is support what already is there for them and what can be done.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting about how it kind of supports building those relationships, just like over a coffee. You can learn so much more if you just have kind of a meal and break bed together. I think that's really interesting. It's especially because it ties into a lot of how we try to do things, where we spend a lot of time at Include 'em, and our project workers are excellent at this, where they spend a huge amount of time building a relationship so they can get to a point where they can really support someone fully and understand what their needs are. And part of that is using food to do it. Part of that is looking at hobbies and looking at those things that, those little things that we enjoy in life.
Definitely. And we have engagement partners who work with our schools. So we spend a lot of time at the very building block stages of delivering provision within a school, to understand that school community, to understand that environment. And our engagement partners will go in, they'll work with the schools to know where they're situated, to be able to develop something that works for them. As if you can embed breakfast provision within the school day, if you can embed it, a lot of schools like to say, as part of who they are, then it's always more successful. The most successful provisions we see are the ones that aren't some add-on at the start of the school day. They're a fundamental part of the experience of learning at that school. We all start the day together. We start the day with breakfast. We all start at that same level, and we're ready to go forward from there.
So what role does that kind of breakfast, as it builds that kind of relationships and communities, what is that role in building community in schools?
I think it's massive. We see it as quite a fundamental piece and community in what we do. Having what for so many people they see as normal breakfast experiences, sat around a table, enjoying food, not just seeing it as a base necessity that you need, but seeing it as something to be loved, something to be enjoyed, something to be shared with other people. It's not necessarily always in the eating. For a lot of schools we work with, it's in the getting it ready, the children, young people spreading their own butter or spreads on bagels, sharing that with the person next to them, having that discussion of, well, I like this, what do you like, what do you prefer, and choice and preference, which for so many people are very standard conversations. But if you're not able to access this, it is very, very different. There's also that aspect to community building where a healthy and nutritious breakfast isn't necessarily what the norm would be. We know from one of our recent research reports, and we do regular engagement with our schools, that there was one school that told us the story of a boy who his normal breakfast routine was he'd go to one of the local shops, have quite an unhealthy breakfast. He would turn up to school sluggish or irritable and not really being ready, and he'd walk into school having had that breakfast and go straight into lessons and then be expected to learn. And so the staff weren't able to fully understand his experience and engage. And what happened at that school is they were able to bring this child into the breakfast provision, bring them in that time before school began, share that breakfast with them around the table, engage with them and have conversations beyond breakfast. They could understand more about where his head was at, what was going on in his life, what was going on that affected his decision making, but also provide him a healthy and nutritious breakfast that then was able to avoid him being sluggish, and he would be alert and aware. And so that really supported him, but then also at home, that supported his mother, who didn't have to worry or think about whether she could always afford what he normally did. Because sometimes it's about money and sometimes it's about time. if you have that ability to know that in the morning, in that frantic space of getting a family ready to school, when they get there, there is food waiting for them, then that can be quite a joyous thing in itself. And parents can engage. Some of our provisions delivered in school playgrounds. And when parents get there, they can see this. And they can see that their child or young person goes in and is engaged in a different community to what they have at home, a mixed community. We also have schools that see how breakfast can open up different conversations. And it is so much about, well, once the food's made, it's on the table, and not just traditional kind of breakfast clubs, but also having breakfast in classrooms as soft start. A teacher can then sit down at a table with their students and say, what's going on in your life? Mm-hmm. Not what's the answer to this maths question, not what are you getting from that specific poem that you're studying, mm-hmm. but what's going on in your life. And that's opened up so many conversations. We've had schools who tell us they've been able to work out from that there's issues with getting school uniform here. Mm. There's quite specific and quite dangerous issues at home. There's that child was acting out yesterday, and that conversation over breakfast the next day can really flesh out why. That staff as well maybe don't have the time in the moment of the school day to be able to bring those out. That we hope that breakfast can help build that community within that learning environment.
And it's interesting to think about how it doesn't necessarily just support the young people or the children in the school, but also the teachers and in some ways the parents as well. So much of your provision or what you do in schools, it will be so impacted by what the school themselves is like, what part of Scotland maybe the school is in, like how do students engage with their teachers, and that influences the way you deliver the breakfast or how breakfast is had in the school. It's really interesting. There was something that I saw in some of the recent reporting from Magic Breakfast around how you have a late provision as well in each school, which I thought was really interesting because I know so many of the young people that we support would really benefit from something like that. But at the same time, they might be excluded informally or formally, so they might not find kind of the before school moments as fulfilling as other people. They might have struggles with social inclusion and so on. So having kind of those considerations is really interesting. So can you speak a little bit to that late provision?
Every school we work in, we see every school in the country as a unique learning environment, and that's why we have an engagement partner system who work with the schools to develop what works in their community. And there's so many different ways our model and so many models can be delivered to actually deliver breakfast provision. But what is the same in every school is that there is some sort of provision for pupils who are late to school. What we find and what we believe that the research backs up as well is that children and young people who are late to school are often in much higher risk categories of living in poverty and having experiences that may lead them to needing the provision itself. So this is done in a number of different ways. There's sometimes food at school offices. When a child arrives and has to sign in, there might be a support worker who is able to take that pupil away for when they come in for 10 minutes before they go to class and have that time with them. And again, have those conversations over food to understand, well, what are the underlying issues here? And so we see that as really quite a fundamental part of what we do, that schools need to make sure that if they're going to cater for all their students, they cater for all their students, regardless of when they appear. But we also find, this is backed up in a number of years from the surveys with the schools we work in, that attendance rates can be increased, that if there is that incentive for a pupil to be there, you're not just expected to turn up and go straight into class. There's that time before school that if you want to come in and you want to have that time to settle, be it with the food, with you and food, and that's that, or with your friends, with your community, then that can be effective as well. So while we always make sure there's that provision for pupils who are late to school, we also try and bring pupils who may normally or have been late before provision came in and see, well, what can we do to really target those at-risk groups of children and young people to try and bring them into the provision.
I think that's so helpful because that acknowledges that some young people are carers themselves and they might really struggle in the mornings. understanding that those moments could be stigmatizing for young people and taking that away by simply, no, you have some breakfast, let's sit and chat anyway, let's take a minute and settle.
Definitely, and it's about looking at schools as a whole, and as I've said a number of times, making it part of what they do, and what that does, and making it part of what they do takes that stigma out, because it's not that pupil has breakfast because they have X issue. That student has breakfast provision because they have Y issue. It's, as a school, we've made a decision that we start our day together in an equitable way with breakfast, and then we all go on and we're all ready at the same position to learn.
Yeah, I love that. It's like pro breakfast schools.
Yeah.
So I guess when it comes to this kind of wider thing, obviously not all schools have this provision. So what could, for example, Scottish Government or decision makers in general be doing to ensure that no child or young person is going to school hungry?
I think what we need from decision makers and from government is action. That the sort of things I'm saying, the sort of things our research backs up, isn't new. It's not a novel concept. But what we need is fast action to understand that breakfast, lunch, dinner are all vital. A wide array of food, of healthy and nutritious food across the day is vital for children and young people. But what we shouldn't see is these things put up against each other. And I think what we need to do is make sure that there's an actionable path from where we are now, where breakfast provision isn't mandatory. From what our research shows is that there is no link between the places in the country as a whole that have breakfast provision and rates of poverty. So whilst organisations like us, we target specific areas and we work where we see the most need, across the entirety of breakfast provision, that doesn't exist. There's no correlation. So it's not like we're in a position where the most at need are targeted already, because they're not. But what we need is promises which exist. Politicians and decision makers in Scotland have agreed that this is an issue. But we need to see those promises become policies and see those policies enacted.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, all of us are already doing quite a lot, but is there anything that people that are working on food insecurity or working in communities could do to help?
I think a lot of it's about awareness and taking in your own experiences and your own knowledge of how you start the day and how we want others to start the day. And taking that and saying, well, no, this is what we need. We need to have that equitable start to make sure that children and young people are empowered to learn. Because if they're hungry when they get to that point of learning, then what's the point? What's the point of asking them to do all of this if they're not ready? And I think as those of us who work in this sector, what we can do is make sure that we help create those policies that put children and young people in the best position to be able to achieve their own ambitions and their own potential.
We are also asking organizations and groups that care about these issues or food insecurity in general to sign an open letter to the First Minister and the Scottish Government. So, if this matters to you, please support us call for action on food insecurity, including, from things like a focus on adequate incomes to ensuring that everyone has breakfast, lunch and dinner. Finally, what is your go-to breakfast?
See, it's a difficult one, my go-to breakfast, because I am different, but one of my grandmother's friends makes my favourite sort of pancake. I don't know what she does differently, but they're just wonderful. So I think those pancakes in particular would be my go-to breakfast, ideally.
Nice. I think I'm a little bit obsessed with coffee, and everyone that knows me knows this about me. But I'm trying to be smarter about it these days. Well, I have a coffee, a glass of water, and then a banana and some toast, and I try to balance it out. But ideally, there would be a croissant thrown in there somewhere, or maybe a little bit of pancakes going. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can keep up with everything Simply Scran by searching for hashtag Simply Scran on Twitter and following at Includem2000, where we will be releasing pieces on addressing food insecurity over the next week and beyond. Where can we find out more about Magic Breakfast?
So you can find us on Twitter at magicbfast_Scott, or you can visit our website at www.magicbreakfast.com.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Please also share this video and maybe tell us what you would like to have for breakfast.